bit over a year and a half, and I lead our product marketing efforts. So that primarily means sort of sitting between the product team and the sales team and the marketing team and making sure everybody's on the same page about what we're building, how it's adding value, and how we actually want to go out and talk about it and sell it. But lately, I've been spending a lot of my time, of course, on artificial intelligence. It's what everybody's thinking about, what everybody's talking about. And yeah, I have a little presentation that I put together. What I found, you guys can all see my screen, right?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. As I talk to prospects, clients, pretty much anybody in the space, is that everybody's curious about AI. Everybody's thinking about it, either because they're excited or because they're terrified, because there's this new thing that they don't really understand that's coming for the industry. But I found that almost nobody really understands sort of what's going on behind this word AI and what's happening with the technology. And obviously, for any sort of savvy shopper, any sort of savvy evaluator, you don't need to be an engineer. You don't need to get all of the ins and outs, but you need to at least kind of have a framework for how to think about what it is that you're buying. So that's where I want to spend most of our time today, talking about first kind of what is artificial intelligence, understanding generative AI specifically, which is what everybody's actually thinking about these days for the most part, whether they realize it or not. And then we'll talk a little bit about what Litify is doing here. I think it's probably take 20-25 minutes, and then we can hang around. I can answer any questions that you guys have about AI, about what Litify is doing. If I don't know, I'll just say I don't know. I'm also not a machine learning engineer, but have been able to spend quite a bit of time with this technology over the last couple of months. Does that sound good to you guys? Awesome. Please feel free to jump in with any questions, any thoughts at any point. I want to hear what you guys have to say as well. As Shaylee can testify to, I hate just talking to myself or at other people for half an hour. So please, guys, jump in, make this as conversational as you'd like. Shaylee is probably sitting there thinking, he always says that, but he loves the sound of his own voice.
I think everybody,
Awesome.
especially everybody on this call, knows that these sessions are so much more lively when we all chat about it. So I think we'll be good, Dean.
Perfect. Awesome. So jumping in, what is artificial intelligence? This is kind of the working definition that we use here at Litify. You know, we think about AI as really any piece of technology that mirrors creative human behavior, whether that's generating original content or making unique decisions, sort of thinking, quote unquote, for itself about a piece of data or a piece of information. And the reason I always start out with this definition is not because it's super useful, but because I almost want to highlight the fact that it's not that helpful. And no broad definition of AI is going to be all that helpful because it's such a broad term. AI can encompass so many different things, really in the same way that the term intelligence can encompass so many different things. You know, if I were to go to one of our executives here at Litify and say, hey, for this new role that we're hiring for on the marketing team, I think we need to get somebody who's really intelligent. Probably the first thing they'd say is, yeah, of course. But the second thing they'd say is, what do you mean by that? You know, what kind of intelligence are you talking about? Are you talking about somebody who's really emotionally intelligent, really good at kind of building relationships and understanding other people? Are you talking about somebody who's really creative and can think outside the box? Are you talking about somebody who can really crunch numbers incredibly effectively? Intelligence can apply to all sorts of different things. So you need to hone in on what are we talking about? And when it comes to artificial intelligence, I really like to encourage people to think in a similar way. You know, when somebody talks about AI, start asking right out the bat, what kind of AI? What are we trying to do here? What do we want to accomplish? Because otherwise you're just throwing around a term that is so broad that it can be meaningless. So what we're really going to try to do today is sort of hone in on when we think about AI, when we talk about AI, what are we talking about? And generally these days, anytime you hear people talking about artificial intelligence, there's a pretty high likelihood, very high likelihood, that really what they're talking about is machine learning. And this is when we're getting to something a little bit more tangible, a little bit more concrete. And machine learning, sort of very broadly, is a subcategory, a type of artificial intelligence that essentially allows an algorithm to learn from the patterns in a data set. So it crunches huge amounts of data and recognizes for itself. You're not telling it patterns, you're not programming them. Hey, all of these things kind of tie together in these ways. And then it's all on its own able to take those learnings and apply them to new data. So the example I always like to use here is sort of a really simple way to do it. You guys have all been logging into something online or purchasing something, and you've had that sort of not a robot security check that's asking you to look at a picture and select all the squares that have something in it, say that have like a taxi in it, maybe. And a lot of times this is going to be leveraging machine learning so that the program knows this has a taxi, this doesn't. And the way that you would teach a machine learning algorithm how to do something like that, how to know if a picture does or doesn't have a taxi, is that you would feed it tons, hundreds or thousands of examples of photos. And some of them are going to have a taxi in them. And you're going to label that, yes, does have a taxi. Others aren't. And maybe they have no vehicles in them. Maybe they have trucks. Maybe they have other cars, whatever it is. And labeling all of those pictures, no, this doesn't have a taxi. And over enough data sets, that algorithm gets really good at figuring out why something is labeled as does have a taxi, does not have a taxi. So then the next time you feed it a photo, it can automatically look at it. It can apply everything it's learned from all of that other data and say, hey, I know enough now to know like this picture does have a taxi in it. This other picture, it doesn't. That's a minivan. I can make those distinctions. And anytime we talk about machine learning, that's essentially what's happening. The algorithm is applying everything it's learned from the data it was trained on to a new piece of data or to a new situation. So that's sort of how the technology works. That's whenever we talk about AI, almost, not always, but almost always what we're actually talking about. Another term you might hear is deep learning. Deep learning gets thrown around a lot in that space. Deep learning is essentially just a type of machine learning. It's one way of doing machine learning that leverages something called a neural network. We're not going to go there today. That would get very technical, but you hear deep learning, think machine learning. And then at Litify, what we see, again, in most of the conversation and most of the tools that are out there are really two sort of applications of machine learning, two ways that we really are seeing this used. The first one, and by far the more mature, more established one, is what I just refer to as predictive analytics. And this is my own terminology, so don't take this and you don't think everybody's going to use that, but that's the label that we here at Litify use. And essentially when we talk about that, we're talking about any program that can take in a bunch of data, primarily kind of numerical data, crunch a ton of numbers in order to make some sort of prediction. So the best example, I think, in legal and with a lot of our customers is, say you want to leverage AI to predict the value of a case as soon as it comes into your system so that you can then your resources. Sorry, guys, I just got a notification that my headphones died. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect.
It switched over, but you're good.
You got me though.
Yep.
Good. I got that little ding in my ear and I'm like, uh-oh, nothing good ever happens after that ding.
At least it wasn't the Zoom update. I've been getting those at the worst times now. Our computers have to be reset so often. It'll be like, in 5 minutes, your computer is shutting down. Great.
Terrible. I know. Been there. Anyway, so predictive analytics. The example I like to use is a case comes into your system. You want to know, what do I think the settlement value is going to be so that I can allocate my resources accordingly? Can AI help with that? And you can set up models. This is already very easy to do if you've got the right tools that essentially look at your training set, which could be all of the past cases that you've worked, that you have data on, that you want to feed into it. And it can look at all of those historical data points and look at things like, where did this lead originate? How did this person come to my firm? What state is it? What type of accident is it? How old are they? Any sort of information that you have that you can feed into it, and then look at the outcome, what all of those cases were settled for. And the machine learning algorithm starts to learn from all of that data to make its own connections, so that then once it's been trained, you have a new case come in and it can look at all of that and spit out a number. Say, I think based on all the case information we have here, this case is going to settle for $100,000, for $150,000. And that is what I call predictive analytics, where essentially you're using AI to analyze a bunch of data to make a specific sort of numerical prediction. We actually have tools to do this right now inside CRMA. CRMA is Salesforce's sort of native business intelligence tool, and it has a AI component where you can do some pretty cool predictive analytics on the data. We're not going to go into that. That's not the purpose of today's conversation, but if that's something you're interested in, definitely talk to Shaylee and she can get you some more information. But probably what all of you guys are thinking about these days is generative AI. That's where all of the hype is. That's what ChatGPT is. Anytime you're kind of using AI to spit out text these days, or even maybe to analyze text, you're probably talking about generative AI, which is much newer, I think much less used, but much more hype because everybody's kind of saying, what is this? What does it mean? And that's what we're going to get into next, is sort of how generative AI works. But before we move on, does anybody have any questions about this? Does this framework make sense to you guys? I see a couple nods. That's good. The reason I spend so much time here, I think this is important, is just because these days I talk to so many people in legal who are thinking exclusively about this, about generative AI. And one of the things I always want to do is kind of back up and say, hey, there are other applications of AI, other types of machine learning that are more established, more mature, safer because of that, and can do some really cool stuff. So let's make sure we're not so fixated on generative AI that we're missing sort of all of the other value that we can start to get from artificial intelligence. But moving on to generative AI, first, I'm curious who on this call has really spent time either playing around with generative AI with something like ChatGPT, or just looking into it, doing research about it?
I've tried to use it. I've had it write me validation rules. I've seen what it would come up with for, I think for data loader or one of the other Salesforce tools, but very minimally. I'm a little afraid of it. I think it's really cool, but I feel like it's so much power. I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, that's fair. See a couple other nods. I think that's pretty common. A lot of people have played with it, just kind of seeing what can this do, and been impressed. A lot of people, I've been very impressed. I don't know, have you guys who have kind of poked around with ChatGPT been impressed with what you've seen?
Have you used it, Ed? Nice.
Very cool. Awesome. So what I want to do here is really kind of dive a little bit into how does generative AI actually work? Because even if you use ChatGPT, even if kind of you poke around with it, it sort of looks like magic. It looks like magic to me, even still. It's just spitting out text. But if you're really going to evaluate this in a professional setting, and especially for a law firm where you're working with a lot of sensitive information, again, you don't need to be an engineer. You don't need to have that level of understanding. But I think to be a savvy consumer here, you do need at least sort of a basic understanding of what's happening with this technology. And the place that I always like to start here is sort of looking at the difference between how machines think
how algorithms think and how humans think. And the big distinction here, and I'm obviously oversimplifying it, a lot of this is being oversimplified sort of for the sake of having a high-level conversation. But the big difference is that machines are thinking in terms primarily of data and specifically of numbers that can be crunched, that can be analyzed, sort of just it's data analysis. While on the other side, humans, the way that we think, the way that we talk, we're using language. And it really can't be, at least for us in our minds and in our conversations, we're not reducing anything down to numbers. We're not reducing anything down to super defined data points. Even just think about the words you use when you talk, and every word is loaded with so many connotations and implications, and it's not sort of that concrete data that a machine is thinking with. So one of the big questions for how do we apply machine learning, how do we apply artificial intelligence to actual language, to get it useful in all of the places where we're not crunching case data, we're not spitting out settlement amounts, but we're actually working with language and documents. How do we build a bridge between those two? And keeping it very high level and very oversimplified, kind of want to talk about two tools that are really critical for doing this. The first one is natural language processing. Natural language processing is not anything terribly new. It's been around for a while, but it's an absolutely critical building block for a lot of the technology that we use these days, but especially for generative AI. And essentially what that's doing is it's just programs and processes for taking natural language, it's what it sounds like, and converting it into data that computers and that algorithms can actually understand and work with, sort of processing the language that we use into analyzable data for a computer. And that, of course, is one of the key sort of building blocks for any sort of artificial intelligence that's going to work with language. And then the other one, and this is what's new here, this is what's really enabled tools like ChatGPT, all of the generative AI that we see, is something called a large language model. And essentially what these models are doing at a very high level is they're being trained on huge, absolutely massive amounts of text. And they, just like we talked about with machine learning, with our taxi example, they're going through all of this data, they're finding patterns and relationships and making connections. Except in this case, what they're learning how to predict is how words should go together. You know, they're learning to look at a string of text, and it could be small, it could be a couple words, it could be very large, and figuring out, okay, looking at this input, this string of text, now I need to predict what comes next. What word or phrase or sentence is most likely to come after this. And then again, and you kind of do that over and over again, and you can string together sentences and phrases and paragraphs and even entire documents that very convincingly mimic sort of the human created text that it's been trained on. And that is sort of a very high level is what these models are doing, is that they're still looking at data, they're making connections, and then using all of that learning to take an input, text, and produce an output. What would be said in response to this? Or what sentence now comes after that other sentence that I just created? And that, when we talk about a tool like ChatGPT, when we talk about generative AI, is going to, at a very high level, what's happening. There are nuances here. There are other things going on. As these models mature, there's going to be more and more sort of accuracy is being built into this, not just what word should come next, but what word should come next that's actually accurate, that actually is correct based on the sources that I have. But that is still, in a lot of ways, being developed. We're still figuring that out. You know, that's why you think about something like hallucinations. You guys have probably all seen the story about the attorney who filed a brief in court that cited a bunch of cases that didn't exist because he had ChatGPT write his brief, and it's called hallucinating, made up all these cases. And the reason that that happens is because ChatGPT wasn't trained to find cases that were real and surface them. It was trained to figure out how to string language together in a way that really looked like a legal brief. And that's a lot of the danger here. And there's solutions to it. There are ways that people are training the models to be better at that accuracy component. But I think when we think about hallucination, when we think about bad data, it's really important to understand, where does that come from? Why does that happen? And this is why it happens. So what is that? Oh, actually, I've got one more technical slide, and we'll get into why does that matter. But are you guys tracking with me so far? Any questions about anything that I just said? All right, very cool. So there's one more concept, and we're getting close to the end here of the technical part. But one more concept that I always really encourage people to understand when it comes to using generative AI. And that's sort of this distinction between a foundation model, which we're going to define in just a second, and the applications that are built on top of it. So when you think about a foundation model, essentially what these are those large language models that I was just talking about that are being developed by being trained on just huge millions, billions of pieces of text in order to be really good at just sort of creating content, generating text in general. And they're not being trained on anything specific, on legal text or medical text or scientific text. They're being trained on everything to basically be conversant across the board, pretty universally. And most of the big generative AI models that are out there right now, this is how those are built. You think about OpenAI's sort of the model behind ChatGPT. It's called GPT-4. So you can ask ChatGPT about anything and it'll have an answer. Maybe there'll be problems, maybe there'll be hallucinations, but it can talk about anything. And that's sort of the model here. That's how this technology is being created, which means that then you're also going to have tools that are coming in and being built on top of that, in the application layer, that are taking these really big, really broad, large language models and applying them to legal. Can we build a chat bot for legal? Or applying them to search. Can we make this work as a search engine and just interact with information on the web to surface it? And the reason that this is, I think, important is because no matter what application you're using, whatever generative AI tool you're using or you're evaluating, the chances are very high that it's going to be built on one of these major foundation models that are out there. But you might not know that right away, looking at their website, looking at their marketing material, what model am I using? And not all of these are going to be created equal. Obviously, OpenAI, their GPT model behind ChatGPT, is the one that's gotten the most attention. From what I've seen, it is still maybe the highest performer in terms of just like convincing language. But there are a lot of other players in this space who are building these models. Google is really involved here. IBM, we found out that Salesforce is developing their own large language models that we're actually in the process of sort of working on getting access to here at Litify. They've got it sort of in beta right now, but that's something that they're developing. And there are going to be differences between these different models. In terms of performance, some of them are going to work better than others. I personally think that OpenAI's model is much more convincing, much more sort of conversant when you put a chatbot on top of it than Google's is. I think Anthropic's works pretty well. They perform differently, but more than that, they're all going to be doing security differently. What do they do with data? How are they protecting your data? How are they making sure that data that comes into the model isn't being exposed in other places? And then you guys are all at law firms, so I think you'll appreciate this point more than a lot of other people. The companies behind these models are also going to sign different contracts. As we've sort of worked on piloting our own generative AI tools and sort of some of the tests that we're doing internally at Litify, this is something that we've had to think a lot about, is let's get our own attorneys involved and make sure that if we use one of these tools, we have a contract with the company behind this model that actually guarantees that they're going to use the data well, that gives the right sort of areas for recourse if they don't. This is technology, but these are also still companies who are signing contracts and making commitments. All that to say, just want to make sure that, again, in order to be a savvy consumer, a savvy shopper here, no one needs to understand all the technical ins and outs of these different foundation models. But I think it makes sense to ask questions. You know, as you go out, as you evaluate generative AI tools, don't be afraid to ask, hey, what model is this built on? Is this using OpenAI? Is this using Google? Is this using something else? And why? Why did you pick that one? Why was that a good security decision? Why was that a good privacy decision? Even if you don't understand and don't need to understand all of the technical elements of how this works, like any good technology evaluator looking at any tool, you should be able to ask questions to at least make sure that the vendor has good answers and is able to justify, hey, this is why I made these choices. This is why I know that this is secure. And that they're not just sort of slapping anything and everything on top of ChatGPT without thinking about it, which I think, I don't know for sure, but I think is what a lot of people are doing these days. So sort of summarizing all of this, making it a little bit practical. What is generative AI good at? And what is generative AI bad at? These generative AI tools are very, very good at mimicking human language. Anybody who has gone in and played around with ChatGPT has seen it's amazing how well written these responses are. They're probably better than a lot of the junior associates at a lot of law firms in terms of their writing capabilities. It can mimic good writing to a pretty remarkable degree, which makes sense, right? When we think about the way it's been trained. It can also mimic the natural flow of a conversation. This is a huge improvement on sort of more traditional chatbots that were very scripted, that sort of got stuck. If you got off the script, they can take the last thing that you said and respond to it very well and sort of mimic the flow of conversation in some really convincing ways. But what are they not good at? They cannot apply common sense. They're not thinking about what they're saying the way that you and I would, right? And again, we think about how they're trained. They're just looking at the text that's coming in and saying what text output would match this based on all of the other data that I've seen. And that's not common sense. That's just simple input, output, X to Y sort of math. They also struggle to sort of contextualize what they're saying within a broader conversation. If you go into ChatGPT and you talk to it long enough and you sort of ask it the same question at different points in a conversation, you'll find pretty quickly that you start to get different and even conflicting answers. And that's because, again, it's not thinking in terms of context. What's everything that I said? How am I staying consistent? It's thinking, all right, based on this last bit of text that you've put in, what should I say next? What's the most likely string of text to match that most likely output? And then, of course, it also struggles with intent, right? It's taking everything at surface value. It's going to have a hard time with irony, with sarcasm, et cetera, which is relevant, right? Especially in y'all's field. People who come to you or to your firms are often emotional. They're often worked up. And there's a danger there. You know, they get frustrated and they say something sarcastic, and generative AI spits out a very deadpan response. And that conversation could get even more frustrating. You know, it could get a little weird. What does this mean for you guys? We already kind of talked about this. No one needs to be machine learning engineers. No one needs to have a super technical understanding here. But what we really want to do at Litify is just make sure that our clients are equipped to have the framework in order to ask good questions. Recognize that even if there is a legal tech logo on a tool, there's a lot happening in the tech stack behind that that's going to affect the security, that's going to affect the performance, and just being able to ask questions to sort of evaluate that at a very high level to make sure that the vendors that you're working with, whether it's us, ask us these questions, or sort of a point solution that you're plugging into Litify, that they've thought about, why did we choose this model? How is our application interacting with this model? Why are things built the way that they are, to make sure that your data is secure and make sure that your client's data is always secure. So if there's any, again, one high level takeaway here, it's take this framework and don't be afraid to ask tons of questions when you evaluate any sort of generative AI tool. That's all I've got on sort of technology part before I give sort of a really high level overview of what Litify is doing. Anybody have any questions there?
I have a question, Dean.
Of course.
When you were explaining the hallucinating with that lawyer and how, you know, it was making up information because it wasn't trained in the legal space, how do people train one of these foundational models to know that information? Like, is that something those companies are going to have to input the information so that it learns it, or how does that happen?
Yeah, so this it gets pretty technical pretty fast, and I'll acknowledge that we're sort of pushing the boundaries of my technical understanding here. But from what I've seen, what I've read, at least one of the major ways, I'm not confident enough in my knowledge to say the main way, but one of the major ways that they're doing this is through something called sort of reinforcement learning, which is where, in addition to training these models on all of this text and letting it recognize patterns and produce outputs, you also have teams of sort of human moderators, responders, who are going through, and as these models make their own outputs, they make their own predictions, they create text, you're sort of saying, yes, this is a good response, no, this is a bad response. And that data point starts to get incorporated in as well. You know, does the human moderator think this is good? Do they think that this is bad? And it reinforces then the model when it is spitting out text that not only is sort of sensible, but is also based on fact, based on however you want to measure that. It reinforces doing that rather than making stuff up. But that's not a silver bullet solution, right? In the sense that, how do you catch every single mistake there? How long do we have to train these models before they never, ever make something up? That's why, at least right now, I think there's always a pretty significant risk of a hallucination, which is something that anybody who's using this professionally needs to be thinking about. It doesn't mean not using it, but it certainly means making sure that you have the right checks and balances and interventions in place to catch those hallucinations, to catch those mistakes before they really do any damage. That's why you see a lot of tools, especially in the legal space, sort of have like a human check component built in. Let us draft this demand letter for you. And then we have a team of people who are going to read it really quickly to make sure it doesn't make anything up. And then we're going to send it. Stuff like that is very common for that reason.
Got it. Very cool. Thank you.
For sure. Any other questions? Any thoughts? Cool. I don't know if that means that I did a really good job or if it just means that this is not helpful at all, but I'll ask Shaylee later. She'll tell me in private.
I'll give you the down low, yeah.
Amazing. So really high level now, just kind of to wrap up, at Litify, how are we thinking about this? How are we thinking about this technology and what we're doing here? And we're really taking a three-pronged approach to development here that actually in a lot of ways just mirrors how we build our product and our product ecosystem in general. The first one, which we're calling Litify AI Labs, is that we have resources dedicated internally to exploring and testing and incubating AI products, and especially generative AI products within our platform. We have a couple things that we're sort of playing around with right now that we're testing internally, or maybe have in beta with 1 or 2 customers, exploring, can we build tools here that are useful, that are also really safe? And we're not rushing this. We made a decision very early on that we would prefer to bring the safest, most secure tool to market rather than the first tool to market. That's always Litify's priority, is safety and security #1. But we recognize that this technology is important, and we're certainly devoting resources to continuing to develop it in-house and develop features and products for our customers. Also, like always, we're working really closely with Salesforce here. Salesforce is investing huge amounts of money into not only machine learning in general, which they've been doing for a long time, but generative AI and these large language models specifically. And we're talking to them all the time and staying really close to, what are you guys building? What are you guys developing that we can start to bring to our customers? Whether that's sort of building it into the core Litify platform, or it's just sort of taking those products that Salesforce has and making them available to you guys as they are, sort of like we would do with something like Shield or CRM analytics today. And then the third one is that, even as we continue to work on things internally, as we continue to work on things with Salesforce, we recognize and we're very aware that there are other startups out there that are moving very quickly and bringing really good products to market. And because that's all that they're doing, all that they're focused on, they're able to do that sort of at a velocity that we're not going to do, because we're moving slowly. We're kind of being more cautious about what we know, what we don't know, developing this the right way. But there are startups that have machine learning engineers who this is all they do, all they think about, that have already brought some stuff to market that's pretty cool, that we think is pretty, we're very confident is pretty safe, sort of based on the due diligence that we've done. And we want to make that available to you guys. And we want to make that useful within the Litify platform. So we're taking a really close look at what legal AI tools are out there that we trust, that we want to go ahead and integrate with, so that you guys can start to use those within Litify right away and sort of get that value, get those use cases as quickly as possible. Even Up is sort of the first big integration that we've done that is live and available. This is a really great company that is using generative AI to generate demand letters. So they can take all of the information that you have on a matter within Litify and the documentation that you have there, and use that to automatically create a demand letter for the case. Then they do have that human review component. They've chosen to have their own team review these demand letters before they send them to you, so that they can weed out any errors, any hallucinations. But it's a great tool. And we're talking to other companies, looking at other companies, sort of working on more integrations like this, hopefully in the near future. That's sort of where we're at. Any questions? Any thoughts? Is this sort of what you guys were hoping to see? Is it helpful?
You're getting good feedback in the chat too, Dean. I don't know if you can see that, but
awesome.
Yeah, I think this was great because, like you said, and I think it's important to note, after we go over the tech side and how one of the biggest risks is the security, that is where we're focusing. And that's why we don't have, a product out there right now, because like you said, anybody could almost take the foundational model and put their name on it, but that's not what we need. And I also love the fact that we get to tap into Salesforce for this and all their resources and all their teams just makes our team that much bigger too. So I'm excited to see more of it in action and what happens.
Yeah, they're doing some cool stuff at Salesforce. And maybe just real high level, because I don't think I covered this in any detail, kind of talking about security concerns. One of the biggest ones, and one of the biggest ones that we're looking at, as you think about the way that these large language models work, they are taking in data from all over the place, all of this, And then this single model, based on all of that learning, is generating responses, generating text for users all over the place. All sorts of disconnected users at different companies in different places. And it's pulling on all of the information that it's been trained on in order to kind of create those responses. What we want to make sure, or what we want to be really sure of, is that if you guys are using a generative AI product built on one of these large language models, that it's not ever being trained on your client's data, on your sensitive information, because once a model is trained on a piece of data, there's no way to guarantee that that information isn't going to pop up in a response for somebody else. So when we think about security, that's the big thing. And Salesforce is investing a lot into solving this problem. There's some stuff that we're doing here as well. But that's the big security thing, is how do we make sure that a model is able to read your information and respond to it, because otherwise it wouldn't be helpful if it wasn't actually looking at your specific case information, but it's not ever being trained on that information. That information is not ever going to surface somewhere else for somebody else. Awesome. Cool. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'll go ahead and give the floor back to you, Shaylee. I think I'll go ahead and hop off, but thank you guys for your time. Thank you for listening to me ramble. And if anybody has any questions after this, any thoughts, then just let Shaylee know. She can sort of pass them along to me, and I'm happy to connect with you guys again.
Yeah, thank